The entire Hanso family stood frozen in their own mansion. Just months ago, they'd dragged the dark-skinned Maid through these very halls, accusing her of stealing, humiliating her in front of their guests, and throwing her out into the rain like garbage. But today, that same Maid walked through the front doors again, not in a uniform, in a black silk dress. Behind her stood Seoul's most feared mafia boss, Kang Min-jae. The family lawyer cleared his throat and announced, "By order of Obsidian Crown Group, this mansion now belongs to Ms. Zariah Amara Cole." The maid they once slapped now owned everything they had left. Zariah slowly looked at Madame Han, the woman who had thrown her into the storm. Then she said calmly, "Don't worry, I'm not here to take revenge." She paused. "I'm here to collect what already belongs to me." Before Zariah Amara Cole became the most powerful woman in Seoul, she was invisible. In the Hanso mansion, she woke before sunrise every morning, polishing marble floors, serving guests who never bothered to learn her name. To them, she wasn't Zariah, she was simply the Black Maid. The guests whispered about her skin, the servants mocked her accent, and Madame Han treated her like she was something that had accidentally crawled into the house. Yet no matter how cruel they were, Zariah never argued. She worked quietly, gracefully, like someone who carried a dignity no humiliation could break. What no one in that mansion knew was that somewhere across the ocean, one of the richest men in the world was dying. And on his final night, billionaire Solomon Cole whispered a name to his lawyers, a daughter he had never met, a daughter who didn't even know she was his, a daughter who was about to inherit an empire worth hundreds of billions. But before the world would know her as the heiress of Obsidian Crown, before Seoul's most dangerous mafia boss would fall in love with her, Zariah Amara Cole would first experience the worst night of her life. The night they accused her of stealing, the night they dragged her outside, the night the rain began to fall, and the night Kang Min-jae saw her. The first light of morning had barely touched the tall glass windows of the Hanso mansion when Zariah Amara Cole was already awake. She moved quietly through the silent halls, a bucket in one hand and a soft cloth in the other, polishing the marble floors that stretched like white rivers beneath the chandeliers. The mansion was enormous, 5 stories of luxury, gold frames, and imported Italian stone, but none of it belonged to her. To the people who lived there, she was simply the maid, or more precisely, the name they liked to whisper when they thought she couldn't hear, the Black Maid. Zariah had worked in the Hanso household for nearly 2 years, long enough to memorize every staircase, every corridor, every fragile vase that cost more than she would earn in a decade. But no matter how perfectly she worked, it was never enough. "Hey, you, maid!" The voice snapped sharply across the hallway. Zariah straightened slowly and turned. One of the younger Hanso relatives stood at the top of the stairs, still wearing silk pajamas, staring down at her with thinly veiled disgust. "You missed a spot," he said lazily, pointing to the marble floor. Zariah walked over and wiped the place again, though she knew it had already been spotless. As she worked, 2 visiting guests passed by. One of them chuckled under his breath. "I didn't know they hired foreigners here." The other whispered loud enough for her to hear, "Not just a foreigner. Look at her skin. She must stick out in photos." They laughed as they walked away. Zariah said nothing. She simply continued polishing the floor, her movements calm and precise. Later that afternoon, the household staff gathered in the kitchen preparing for another lavish dinner party. The head maid shoved a tray into Zariah's hands. "Hurry up," she snapped. "Guests will arrive soon, and Madame Han doesn't want them seeing you standing around." Another maid rolled her eyes. "Honestly, I don't even know why they hired her. This is a prestigious house, not some charity." Zariah lowered her gaze and carried the tray out. Across the mansion, Madame Han stood in the grand living room inspecting the decorations. The moment she saw Zariah enter, her expression tightened. "You," she said coldly. "Don't walk through the main hall when the guests arrive. Stay in the back corridors." Zariah nodded politely. "Yes, madam." Madame Han turned away with a scoff. "Honestly," she muttered to a friend nearby, "these people should know their place." The words lingered in the air long after she walked away. Zariah stood quietly beside the table, arranging glasses for the evening. For a moment, one of the younger servants looked at her curiously. "Doesn't it bother you," he asked, quietly, "the way they talk about you?" Zariah paused, her fingers resting gently on the edge of a crystal glass. Then she smiled softly, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a calm strength that seemed untouched by the cruelty around her. "Dignity doesn't come from money," she said quietly. Her eyes lifted toward the towering windows of the mansion. "It comes from the soul." The servants stared at her in silence. What none of them realized was that the quiet woman they mocked every day was carrying a storm in her destiny. And before long, the entire Hanso mansion would learn exactly who Zariah Amara Cole truly was.
Before we continue, welcome to Afro-Korean love thrillers, your home for dark romance, forbidden passion, power, betrayal, and unforgettable revenge stories. Quick favor, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to us. Your support keeps these powerful stories coming. So, go ahead, tap that subscribe button now. Sit back, relax, because this story is only just getting started. Now, let's dive back in.
By the time night settled over Seoul, the Hanso mansion no longer looked like a home. It looked like a palace. Golden lights illuminated the long driveway as sleek luxury cars rolled through the gates one after another. Valets hurried to open doors while elegantly dressed guests stepped out, their laughter and conversation drifting into the cool evening air. Inside, the mansion buzzed with quiet urgency. Servants moved quickly through the halls carrying trays of champagne and delicate plates of food. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the grand hall. Tonight was not an ordinary gathering. The Hanso family had invited some of the most powerful people in Seoul. Corporate executives, media moguls, foreign investors, even a few celebrities whose faces were instantly recognizable. But there was one guest whose presence made everyone slightly more careful with their words. Kang Min-jae. Whispers moved through the crowd the moment his name appeared on the guest list. Some called him a businessman. Others called him something else entirely. The shadow of Gangnam. No one ever said the word Mafia out loud, but everyone understood. A black car pulled up quietly in front of the mansion. The driver stepped out first, opening the back door. Kang Min-jae emerged slowly, tall, calm, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit. His expression carried the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. Inside the mansion, conversations shifted the moment he entered. Madame Han greeted him with a practiced smile, bowing slightly. "Mr. Kang, it's an honor to have you here tonight." Min-jae nodded politely, though his eyes were already scanning the room with quiet detachment. Parties bored him. They were always the same, people chasing influence, pretending to be more powerful than they were. A server passed him a glass of champagne. He took it absently and stepped toward the balcony doors, looking out over the glowing city lights of Seoul. Then something caught his attention. Not a voice, not a sound, a presence. Across the room, near the long dining table, a young woman was arranging crystal glasses with careful precision. She wore the simple black uniform of the household staff, just a maid. Yet something about the way she stood made him pause. Her posture was straight, her movements graceful. There was no nervousness in the way she carried herself, no shrinking or rushing the way most servants did when surrounded by powerful guests. Instead, she moved with quiet composure, as though she belonged in a palace far grander than this one. Min Jae's gaze lingered for a moment. One of the businessmen beside him noticed. "You're looking at the staff?" the man said with a chuckle. "That's just one of the maids." Min Jae didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still on her. The maid finished arranging the glasses and lifted her head slightly, her expression calm and unreadable. For a brief second, their eyes met across the crowded hall. Min Jae felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not because she was beautiful, not because she was a maid, but because the woman standing in that uniform carried herself like someone who had never truly been beneath anyone, as if royalty had simply been dressed in servant's clothing. And though he didn't know her name yet, Kang Min Jae suddenly found himself wondering why. The party grew louder as the night deepened. Music floated through the grand hall while laughter echoed beneath the high ceilings of the Hanseo mansion. Crystal glasses clinked together as powerful guests discussed business deals, investments, and influence. Zariah moved quietly among them with a tray of champagne, invisible, just the way Madame Han preferred it. Yet even as she passed through the crowd, she could still feel the occasional curious glance. Some guests whispered, others simply looked past her as if she were part of the furniture. Across the room, Kang Min Jae remained near the balcony doors, observing the party with calm detachment. But every now and then, his gaze drifted back toward the same place, toward the quiet maid who carried herself like she belonged somewhere far greater than this mansion. Then suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the music. "My necklace!" The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Madame Han, who stood near the center of the hall, clutching her throat in shock. "My diamond necklace is gone!" she cried. Guests murmured in confusion. "That necklace is worth millions," one woman whispered. "It was just here," Madame Han continued angrily. "Someone stole it." The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Stole. Security quickly began searching the area while the household staff gathered nervously along the wall. Madame Han's eyes scanned the servants one by one. Then they stopped, on Zariah. Her gaze hardened instantly. "You!" she said sharply, pointing. Zariah blinked in surprise. "Madame?" Madame Han's voice rose. "You were just near my dressing room earlier, weren't you?" Zariah shook her head slowly. "I was preparing the dining table, Madame." But Madame Han had already made up her mind. "Search her room." Gasps rippled through the guests. 2 security guards immediately headed upstairs. Zariah stood frozen in the center of the hall, surrounded by strangers staring at her as though the verdict had already been decided. From across the room, Kang Min Jae remained near the balcony doors, observing the party with calm detachment. But every now and then, his gaze drifted back toward the same place, toward the quiet maid who carried herself like she belonged somewhere far greater than this mansion. Then suddenly, a sharp scream cut through the music. "What a shame!" The music inside the Hanseo mansion continued to play as if nothing had happened. But near the front doors, the atmosphere was far colder. 2 security guards gripped Zariah by the arms, dragging her through the grand hallway while whispers followed behind them like shadows. Some guests turned away uncomfortably. Others watched with open curiosity. The shattered glasses from the tray still sparkled on the marble floor behind her, reflecting the bright chandelier lights above. Madame Han's voice cut through the murmurs. "Take her out through the front. I want everyone to see what happens to thieves." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. Zariah didn't struggle. She walked quietly between the guards, her cheeks still burning from the slap, her uniform slightly damped from the spilled champagne. As the doors opened, a gust of cold wind swept into the hallway. Outside, the rain had begun to fall. Heavy, relentless. The guards shoved her down the steps, her small suitcase thrown after her. It landed beside her with a dull thud. One of the guards sneered. "Consider yourself lucky," he said. Madame Han decided not to call the police. The doors slammed shut behind them. Inside, the party continued. Laughter, music, crystal glasses clinking together. Through the tall windows, several guests could still be seen watching. No one came outside. Zariah sat slowly on the cold stone steps, rain soaking through her clothes within seconds. The water ran down her face, blending with tears she refused to let fall. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at the long driveway stretching toward the mansion. The world suddenly felt very quiet, very empty. The rain fell harder. She stood slowly, lifting the suitcase with trembling fingers, and began walking toward the gate. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached the iron gates at the end of the driveway, the rain had completely drenched her hair and uniform. Her strength finally gave out. Zariah leaned against the cold metal bars, her vision blurring as exhaustion overtook her. Then her knees buckled. At that exact moment, a black Rolls-Royce glided slowly down the driveway. Inside the car, Kang Min-jae sat in the back seat, one arm resting casually along the leather seat as the mansion faded behind them. He had already decided the party had lasted long enough. But as the car approached the gates, something made him look up. A figure collapsed against the iron bars. "Stop," he said quietly. The driver immediately pressed the brakes. Rain streaked across the windshield as Min-jae stepped out of the car. The cold night air wrapped around him, but he barely noticed. His gaze focused on the woman slumped near the gate. The maid, Zariah. Her clothes were soaked, her hair clinging to her face as she struggled to stay conscious. For a moment, Min-jae simply stood there, watching her. Then he slowly removed his coat and walked toward her. When he reached her side, he crouched down, draping the coat gently over her shoulders. Up close, he could see the faint redness still lingering on her cheek. His eyes darkened. Zariah looked up weakly, surprised to see someone kneeling beside her in the rain. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Min-jae said quietly, "You don't look like someone who belongs in the rain." Zariah's lips trembled faintly, but her voice remained soft. "I'm used to it." For the first time that night, Kang Min-jae felt something inside him shift. And though neither of them knew it yet, this moment, beneath the cold soul rain, would change both of their lives forever. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets, drumming against the black umbrella the driver had hurried to open beside the Rolls-Royce. But Kang Min-jae barely noticed it. His attention was fixed entirely on the woman sitting weakly against the iron gate. Zariah's hair clung to her face, and her thin uniform was soaked through, the cold night air biting at her skin. Yet even in that state, there was something strangely composed about her. Not defeated, just tired. Min-jae crouched in front of her and carefully placed his coat over her shoulders. The fabric was warm and heavy, shielding her from the relentless rain. "You don't look like someone who belongs in the rain," he said quietly. Zariah looked up at him, surprised. For a moment, she simply studied his face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the calm authority in his eyes, the quiet power that surrounded him like an invisible shield. She had seen him earlier that night, at the party, one of the powerful men everyone had whispered about. Her voice was soft when she answered, "I'm used to it." Min-jae's gaze lingered on her face, then drifted briefly to the faint red mark still visible on her cheek. He didn't ask who had done it. He already knew. Behind them, the Hanso mansion glowed with warm lights, music still floating faintly through the rain. The party continued as if nothing had happened. Min-jae stood slowly and turned to his driver. "Open the car." The driver immediately rushed to obey. Then Min-jae extended his hand towards Zariah. For a moment she hesitated, not because she didn't want help, but because accepting it meant admitting how completely alone she had just become. Still, exhaustion won. She placed her hand in his. His grip was steady, firm, pulling her gently to her feet. Even standing beside him now, soaked and humiliated, Zariah held her posture with quiet dignity. Min-jae noticed. Most people in her position would have been crying, shouting, or begging for help. She did none of those things. Instead, she simply picked up her small suitcase. Min-jae watched her carefully. "You're not angry," he said. Zariah glanced briefly back at the mansion gates, rain sliding down her face. "I'm used to it," she replied calmly. There was no bitterness in her voice, just quiet acceptance. Something about that unsettled him. He had spent his entire life around people driven by greed, rage, ambition, and fear. But this woman, this maid they had thrown out like trash, carried herself with a kind of strength he rarely saw even among kings. Min-jae opened the back door of the Rolls-Royce himself. "You'll get sick if you stay out here," he said. Zariah looked at the car, then back at him. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Min-jae considered the question for a moment. The truth is, he didn't know. Perhaps it was the slap he had witnessed. Perhaps it was the way she had stood in that room surrounded by accusations, yet never lost her composure. Or perhaps it was simply instinct. "You looked like someone who needed help," he said finally. Then he gestured toward the seat. "Come." After a brief pause, Zariah stepped into the car. As the door closed behind her and the Rolls-Royce began to move down the rain-soaked road, neither of them realized that the moment they had just shared was the beginning of something far more powerful than either of them expected. Morning arrived slowly over Seoul, the rain finally fading into a gray mist that clung to the city skyline. Inside a quiet penthouse overlooking the Han River, Zariah stood near the large windows, wrapped in a borrowed sweater one of the house staff had brought her the night before. Kang Min-jae's coat still hung loosely over her shoulders, the fabric warm despite the cool morning air. She hadn't slept much. Everything about the night before still felt unreal. The accusation, the slap, the rain, the strange, calm man who had lifted her out of the darkness without asking for anything in return. Behind her, Min-jae stood near a large desk, reviewing something on a tablet handed to him moments earlier by one of his trusted associates. The information had arrived just before dawn. At first, he thought it was some kind of mistake, but the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. Across the world, Solomon Cole, one of the wealthiest men on the planet, had died only hours ago, and the legal teams managing his estate had launched an urgent global search for the heir mentioned in his final instructions. Min-jae had access to networks most people never even knew existed, and through those channels, the truth had surfaced. He looked toward the woman standing quietly by the window, the maid who had been thrown into the rain. The name on the report still felt surreal. Zariah Amara Cole. Min-jae picked up the thin leather folder resting on the desk and walked toward her. Zariah turned slightly when she sensed him approach. "You should sit," he said calmly. She studied his expression for a moment before taking the seat across from him. Min-jae placed the folder gently on the table between them. "What is it?" she asked. He opened the folder and slid several documents across the surface. Legal papers, financial records, a photograph of a man she had never seen before. Zariah frowned slightly as she scanned the pages. Then her eyes caught the name printed at the top of the first document, Solomon Cole. Her breath slowed. "I don't understand," she said softly. Min-jae leaned back slightly in his chair, watching her reaction carefully. "Last night, a billionaire died in New York." Zariah looked up, confused. "And?" she asked. "He left behind one of the largest private empires in the world, a multinational corporation called Obsidian Crown Group." Zariah's brow furrowed. "I've heard of it," she said quietly. "Everyone has." Min-jae nodded once. "Yes." He tapped the final document, and according to his final legal declaration, his voice remained calm, but the weight of the words filled the room. "You are the sole heir of Obsidian Crown Group." The silence that followed felt endless. Zariah stared at him as if she had misheard. "That's impossible," she whispered. Min-jae slid the DNA report toward her. "It's not. Her eyes moved across the page slowly. Genetic verification. Legal confirmation. Her name, Zariah Amara Cole. Her hands trembled slightly as the truth settled in. The girl who had been dragged through a mansion hallway and thrown into the rain only hours ago was now the heir to one of the most powerful empires on Earth. Zariah leaned back slowly in the chair, her voice barely more than a breath. "My whole life." Min-jae watched her quietly. "Yes," he said. "In one moment, everything has changed." The world did not change overnight for Zariah Amara Cole. But the first step of her transformation began the moment the truth reached the boardrooms of Obsidian Crown Group. Within days, private jets arrived in Seoul, carrying lawyers, executives, and advisors from across the globe. Their arrival alone sent waves through the international business world. News outlets began whispering about a mysterious heir discovered just hours after Solomon Cole's death. Inside Min-jae's penthouse, the quiet maid who once polished marble floors now sat across from some of the most powerful corporate minds in the world. At first, Zariah listened more than she spoke. Stacks of reports filled the table. Company holdings, global subsidiaries, investment portfolios worth billions. The empire her father had built was enormous. Luxury hotels across continents, private security firms guarding world leaders, rare mineral mines and diamond reserves. All of it now carried the same name on the legal documents, Zariah Amara Cole. One afternoon, after hours of meetings, one of the senior executives finally asked the question that had been lingering in the room. "Miss Cole, do you wish to sell your controlling shares, or would you prefer to appoint a board guardian to manage the empire for you?" They expected hesitation. They expected uncertainty. After all, only days ago she had been a servant. Zariah folded her hands calmly on the table. "No," she said. The executives looked at one another. "I will run it." The room fell silent, and that was the moment the empire realized its new queen had arrived. The days that followed became a blur of transformation. Zariah trained with advisors late into the night, learning the inner machinery of Obsidian Crown. Finance, corporate strategy, negotiation. She absorbed knowledge quickly, her mind sharp and focused. It was as if she had been preparing for this life without knowing it. Min-jae watched quietly from the edges of these meetings. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but whenever the room grew tense, whenever someone attempted to test the young heiress, his presence alone reminded them that Zariah was not alone. Soon the world learned her name. The media reveal came suddenly. One morning, every major financial network displayed the same headline: Obsidian Crown Heir Discovered. Cameras flashed as Zariah stepped out of a black car in front of a corporate tower in Seoul. Elegant, confident, no trace of the maid who had once walked the halls of the Hanso mansion. Standing beside her was Kang Min-jae. Reporters shouted questions as they approached. "Miss Cole, where have you been all these years? What will you do with the empire? Are the rumors about your connection to Kang Min-jae true?" Zariah paused before entering the building. Her eyes briefly met Min-jae's. There was a quiet understanding between them now. Trust, gratitude, something deeper growing beneath the surface. Later that evening, the two of them stood together on the penthouse balcony overlooking the glowing city of Seoul. The wind carried the distant hum of traffic below. "You're not afraid," Min-jae said after a long silence. Zariah looked out at the skyline. "I've already lost everything once," she replied softly. Then she turned toward him. "Power doesn't scare me." Min-jae studied her face.
In the days since the rain, something inside him had begun to shift. This woman was no longer just someone he had rescued. She was becoming something far more dangerous, someone the entire world would soon have to respect. And as the lights of soul reflected in her eyes, Kang Min-jae realized something else. He wasn't just watching a queen rise. He was falling in love with her.
The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. At the Hanseo corporate headquarters, the morning trading reports arrived like they always did, printed neatly and placed on the long conference table before the board meeting. Chairman Han adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the numbers. Then he frowned. "That can't be right," he muttered. One of the executives leaned forward. "What is it, sir?" Han turned the report around slowly. "Our stock dropped 12% overnight." The room fell silent. "That's impossible," another executive said quickly. "There's been no scandal, no policy change, nothing that would cause—" Before he could finish, the door opened. A young assistant rushed in, pale and breathless. "Sir, several of our investors have pulled their funding." "What?" Chairman Han snapped. "3 major investment groups withdrew this morning. They're selling their shares immediately." The tension in the room thickened. Within hours, the news worsened. Phones began ringing non-stop across the building. Partners suddenly reconsidered their contracts. Banks demanded immediate repayment of outstanding loans. Investors who had once competed for the Hanseo family's attention now refused to answer calls. By midday, the company's stock had fallen again and again. Panic began spreading through the boardroom. "This doesn't make sense," one director whispered. "Our accounts were stable yesterday." Chairman Han slammed his hand on the table. "Find out who's behind this." Across the city, Madame Han sat in the living room of the mansion, scrolling nervously through financial news on her tablet. Her face slowly drained of color. Another headline appeared. Hanseo Group losing investor confidence. She grabbed her phone and dialed her husband immediately. "What is happening?" she demanded the moment he answered. "It's under control," Chairman Han said stiffly, though his voice betrayed his worry. But even as he spoke, another executive rushed toward him with fresh documents. "Sir, the banks are calling our loans." "What do you mean, calling them?" Chairman Han snapped. "Those loans aren't due for years." The executive swallowed nervously. "They say a major financial authority has withdrawn support from our credit lines." A cold silence spread through the room. Chairman Han's mind raced. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal market pressure. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone was cutting off every source of power his family relied on. Investors, banks, contracts. One by one, they were disappearing. That evening, the Hanseo family gathered in the mansion's dining room, tension hanging heavy in the air. Madame Han looked at the latest financial reports, her hands trembling slightly. "Who would do something like this?" she whispered. Chairman Han stared at the numbers in silence. Then slowly, a realization crept into his mind. This level of influence, this level of control, only someone extremely powerful could orchestrate it. Someone with global financial reach, someone who could make investors vanish with a single phone call. Madame Han's voice broke the silence. "Do you think it's Obsidian Crown?" The room went still. Chairman Han looked up sharply. Obsidian Crown Group was one of the few empires powerful enough to destroy a company overnight. But that made no sense. They had never even dealt with them directly. "Why would they target us?" he asked quietly. No one had an answer. Yet somewhere in Seoul, high above the glowing city lights, Zariah Amara Cole stood on a balcony beside Kang Min-jae, watching the skyline with calm, thoughtful eyes. And though the Hanseo family did not know it yet, the storm destroying their empire had only just begun. The silence outside the Hanso mansion felt heavier than the storm that had once soaked its front steps. Servants stood frozen along the walls. Security guards watched carefully from the driveway. Even the evening wind seemed to slow as the truth settled over the household. The woman standing before them was no longer the quiet maid who had once polished their floors. Zariah Amara Cole stood calmly at the top of the entrance steps, the soft lights of the mansion glowing behind her like a crown of gold. Chairman Han's voice trembled slightly. You're saying you own this house?" Zariah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked slowly around the mansion, the marble pillars, the tall windows, the doors that had once slammed shut behind her while rain poured down the driveway. For a brief moment, her eyes lingered on the exact spot where she had stood that night. Then she turned back to them. Before Chairman Han could speak again, Madame Han suddenly stepped forward, her face pale with disbelief. Her eyes moved slowly over Zariah's elegant dress, the powerful men standing behind her, the black cars filling the driveway. Then realization struck. Her voice came out as a frightened whisper. You were the maid." For a moment, no one moved. Zariah looked at her calmly. Then a small, quiet smile touched her lips. Yes. The word landed in the air like a verdict. Madame Han staggered slightly backward. It suddenly made sense. The collapsing businesses, the disappearing investors, the banks demanding repayment. They had not been facing random misfortune. They had been facing her. Zariah reached into the folder carried by one of the lawyers behind her and pulled out several documents. She stepped forward and handed them to Chairman Han. He took them with trembling hands. Eviction papers, legal ownership transfers, official seals from Obsidian Crown Group. His voice cracked as he read the first line. You're removing us?" Zariah's expression remained composed. "I told you to leave this house once," she said softly. Her gaze met Madame Han's. "Then I decided to buy it." The words cut deeper than any insult. The servants watched in stunned silence. And behind Zariah, Kang Min-jae stood quietly, his presence as steady and immovable as a mountain beside her, a king beside his queen. For a moment, it seemed the story had reached its perfect ending. Justice had arrived. The maid had risen. The powerful had fallen. Then, suddenly, a phone rang. The sharp sound broke the stillness. Min-jae reached slowly into his pocket and glanced at the screen. The moment he saw the name, his expression changed. The calm darkness in his eyes turned colder, dangerous. Zariah noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Min-jae answered the call without looking away from the mansion. The voice on the other end was calm, confident, and unmistakably threatening. "Min-jae," the man said, "I hear Seoul has a new queen." Min-jae's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be in this city," he replied. The voice chuckled softly. "Oh, but I had to come." A brief pause followed. Then the man spoke again. "Because if Zariah Amara Cole becomes queen of Obsidian Crown," his voice lowered, "she becomes my enemy." Min-jae ended the call slowly. For the first time that night, the victory in the air felt incomplete. Zariah stepped closer to him. "Who was that?" Min-jae looked out toward the dark city beyond the dates. "A man from my past," he said quietly. "A man powerful enough to start wars. A man ruthless enough to destroy empires. And somewhere in the shadows of Seoul, that man had just arrived. Because the truth was far more dangerous than anyone standing in the Hanso mansion realized. Zariah Amara Cole had only just claimed her empire, and now the war for it had begun."
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. It keeps these powerful, unforgettable stories coming your way. Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Thank you for watching till the end. You're a part of this journey now. We'll see you in the next story. Thank you.